When Gaddafi seized power in Libya in September 1969, the United States was among the first countries to recognize the new regime. The speed of this recognition shocked many in the Arab world. Some even speculated that Gaddafi might have been a U.S. puppet. At the time, Washington hoped he might be another oil-rich leader they could work with. In fact, the U.S. moved swiftly to hand over its key military base, located just outside Tripoli. They left behind equipment and personnel housing, apparently ready to cooperate with the new Libyan leadership. Furthermore, U.S. intelligence agencies were said to have helped thwart 2 coup attempts against Gaddafi in 1969 and 1970. But this honeymoon period didn't last. You see, Gaddafi was young, ambitious, and filled with pan-Arab and anti-colonial zeal. He began delivering speeches filled with fury against Western imperialism. He condemned the US and Britain openly and started funneling money to groups hostile to American interests. By 1973, the US had had enough. Washington began scaling back its diplomatic presence and imposed an arms embargo. From that point forward, the relationship entered a slow and steady decline. Though Gaddafi was no communist, he strategically leaned toward the Soviet Union to unsettle the Americans. Libya soon became a top-tier Soviet client state, buying billions of dollars in Soviet weaponry. But the Soviets never fully trusted Gaddafi. They saw him as unpredictable and prone to grand, impulsive decisions. As a result, they kept their distance, using him for leverage but never fully embracing him. By the time President Jimmy Carter took office in 1977, Gaddafi had become openly hostile. In 1979, when Iranian revolutionaries stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 53 Americans hostage, Gaddafi was one of the few leaders to publicly support the move. That same year, the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli was attacked by a massive mob and burned to the ground. When Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, he vowed to take a hard line against America's enemies. It didn't take long for him to set his sights on Muammar Gaddafi. With his explosive speeches and open support for terrorist groups, Gaddafi was quickly cast as enemy number 1. Reagan famously labeled him the mad dog of the Middle East. You see, throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Gaddafi had become a self-declared messiah for the world's rebels and outcasts. In the name of justice and revolution, his regime funneled petrodollars into a global insurgency network that reached across continents, from the back streets of Manila to the alleyways in Dublin, Chicago's underground cells, and the battle-scarred neighborhoods of Beirut. Tripoli, the Libyan capital, became infamous, not for diplomacy or trade, but as an international university of terror. Militants from around the globe passed through Libyan camps, learning the tactics of sabotage, guerrilla warfare, and assassination. By channeling money and arms to revolutionaries and insurgents, Gaddafi accomplished multiple objectives. He could harass and retaliate against former colonial rulers, elevate Islam as a political force, empower small nations struggling for independence, and destabilize regimes he found ideologically offensive. His support was often erratic and contradictory. He backed Islamists and Marxists, secularists and fanatics, Shia and Sunni, leftists and ultranationalists. Still, in the Arab street, he was admired for his audacity and courage in challenging the West, especially the United States. At the heart of his mission, however, was a cause he considered sacred: Palestine. Gaddafi's stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was personal and violently uncompromising. While most Arab nations gradually shifted toward diplomacy with Israel, Gaddafi reacted with fury. Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and even Syria began exploring peaceful resolutions. The Libyan leader denounced them all, condemning them as traitors to Islam and demanding that their governments be overthrown. As the Palestinians realized that traditional warfare against Israel was unsustainable, Gaddafi saw an opening. He would use Libya's immense oil wealth to fund those factions willing to take a more extreme approach. Gaddafi diverted his support to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, a group infamous for hijackings and bombings. It was through these associations that he became closely linked to Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, better known as Carlos the Jackal, a Venezuelan-born international terrorist and a close ally of the PFLP. Their friendship epitomized Gaddafi's shift from revolutionary supporter to global terror sponsor. One of the most notorious examples of Gaddafi's support came in 1972 when he funded the Black September organization, which carried out the Munich massacre, killing 11 Israeli athletes and 1 German police officer during the Olympics in West Germany. After the attack, Gaddafi had the militants' bodies flown back to Libya for a hero's funeral, treating them not as criminals but as martyrs in a struggle for liberation. 1 year later, a Libyan-backed group called the National Arab Youth for the Liberation of Palestine launched a brutal attack at an airport in Rome. They threw thermite bombs into a Pan Am jet, killing 32 innocent people and injuring 18 more. Even as Libya's oil revenues dipped in the early 1980s and Gaddafi faced growing US sanctions, he continued to bankroll militants. In 1981 alone, he reportedly spent $100 million funding Palestinian operations. Gaddafi's reach didn't stop at the Middle East. It also stretched deep into Europe's radical underground. In Spain, he funded the ETA, the Basque separatists responsible for over 820 deaths. In Italy, he backed the Red Brigades, a militant communist faction linked to the PLO. France's Action Directe, known for bombings and political assassinations, also received his support. So did Germany's Baader-Meinhof group, one of Europe's most feared far-left insurgencies. Even the Armenian Secret Army for the Liberation of Armenia, fighting to avenge the 1915 genocide, was on Gaddafi's payroll. Alongside his support for armed struggle, Gaddafi also cultivated unlikely political alliances, none more curious than his bond with Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu. Both leaders had come to power at a young age and aspired to elevate their countries to global prominence. As a result of their friendship, Romania received Libyan oil on favorable terms, and its secret police had access to Libya's enormous stash of confiscated foreign passports. Meanwhile, in Latin America, Gaddafi's geopolitical ambitions were expanding rapidly. The region, long shaped by American influence and Cold War power plays, offered the Libyan leader a prime opportunity to challenge Washington's dominance. His involvement in Nicaragua was a flashpoint. In 1979, the Sandinista National Liberation Front, a populist and leftist movement, overthrew the deeply corrupt Somoza dictatorship, one of America's most loyal allies in the region. To the Reagan administration, the Sandinistas represented everything they feared: anti-American and extremely Marxist. Although the US responded with sanctions and armed support for the Contras, a counter-revolutionary force, Gaddafi aligned himself with the Sandinistas, offering them ideological and material support. Nicaragua was not alone. Gaddafi's money also found its way into guerrilla movements in Guatemala and El Salvador, both countries already devastated by brutal civil wars. In these regions, Libyan support helped sustain conflict, deepen bloodshed, and prolong instability. In Asia, Gaddafi's ambitions took on a more ideological and religious flavor. With hundreds of millions of Muslims living in the region and a diverse array of Islamic nations, he saw Asia as a vital front in his campaign to spread Libya's influence. In the Philippines, Libya played a crucial role in the rise of the Moro National Liberation Front, the MNLF, a secessionist group based in the southern islands. Beginning in the early 1970s, the MNLF launched a violent campaign for independence, engaging in both terrorism and large-scale military conflict with the Philippine Army. With Gaddafi's support in the form of money and weapons, the MNLF's activities grew increasingly destructive. Libya became a vital external sponsor of a conflict that would persist for decades and cause widespread devastation across the region. Inside Reagan's administration, CIA Director William Casey and National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane pushed aggressively for actions against Gaddafi. Previously, in August 1981, US Navy planes had conducted exercises in the Gulf of Sirte, a region Libya claimed as its territorial waters. The US refused to acknowledge this claim. As a result, when 2 Libyan fighter jets approached, they were shot down by US Tomcats. This was a direct military engagement, one of the first under Reagan's watch. Consequently, in December that year, stories broke in the American press that Gaddafi had dispatched a hit squad to assassinate Reagan, supposedly led by the infamous terrorist Carlos the Jackal. Gaddafi, in a rare live interview, furiously denied the allegations, but it was too late. The image of him as a direct threat to President Reagan had already taken hold, adding fuel to an already burning fire. In 1982, Reagan banned the import of Libyan oil and limited exports to essentials like food and medicine. In 1986, all U.S. companies were ordered to leave Libya. The U.S. closed Libya's assets and declared the country a national security threat. The sanctions hit hard. Libya lost over a third of its oil revenue overnight. Furthermore, the U.S. ramped up its pressure on Gaddafi by supporting his rivals across North and Central Africa. American weapons and aid flowed into countries like Sudan, Tunisia, Algeria, Liberia, and Chad. Around the same time, Libya's ties with Britain would take a dramatic turn for the worse after a tragic and highly publicized incident in London when a British policewoman was fatally shot outside the Libyan embassy during an anti-Gaddafi protest. On the morning of April 17, 1984, Police Constable Yvonne Fletcher stood on duty outside the Libyan embassy in St. James's Square, London. She had been assigned to monitor a planned protest organized by Libyan dissidents determined to speak out against the repression of Gaddafi's regime. Standing beside her was her fiancé and fellow officer, Michael Little. Neither of them knew that within moments, their lives and the relationship between Britain and Libya would be changed forever. 2 days earlier, on April 15th, Libyan students in London had learned of a horrifying development back home. 2 students from the University of Tripoli had been publicly executed, likely for voicing opposition to the Gaddafi regime. For the Libyans in exile, it was yet another reminder of the brutality they had fled. In response, they organized a peaceful demonstration outside the Libyan embassy in London, but word of the protest had reached the embassy. On April 16th, the staff inside the building, many of them hardcore Gaddafi loyalists, called for reinforcements. Soon, Gaddafi supporters from across the UK were summoned to mount a counter-demonstration. That morning, as the protests began, tension ran high. Fletcher and her colleagues were caught between the two groups. Then, from inside the Libyan embassy itself, shots rang out. A gunman, firing from within the supposedly diplomatic premises, targeted the dissidents outside. Unfortunately, one of the bullets tore through Yvonne Fletcher, ripping into her abdomen and sending her crashing to the ground in agony. Despite frantic efforts by her fellow officers and paramedics, Fletcher was pronounced dead by midday. The murder of a British officer by a foreign diplomat on British soil was an event so surreal, so audacious, that there was no precedent. The British police were outraged. The public was in shock. Yet the legal and diplomatic framework for handling such a crime simply didn't exist. The shooter, whoever they were, could not be arrested without triggering an international crisis. Ultimately, the result was a complete breakdown of diplomatic relations between Libya and Britain. After 10 days of tense negotiations, it was agreed that all Libyan diplomats working at the embassy would be expelled from Britain. They were escorted to Heathrow Airport, briefly questioned, and then flown back to Tripoli. Fletcher's murder, in Gaddafi's eyes, was Britain's fault. The colonel saw it as part of a Western-backed campaign to destabilize his regime. His hatred for Britain, already intense, became personal. He loathed British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and strengthened a covert alliance he had been nurturing for years with the Provisional Irish Republican Army.
Mr. President, are we in a state of undeclared war with Libya?
Not on his side. He's declared it. We just haven't recognized the declaration yet, nor will we. No, it's, as I say, we're going to defend ourselves, and we're certainly going to take action in the face of specific terrorist threats.
By 1985, a new wave of terrorism hit the West. Attacks in airports in Rome and Vienna left 20 people dead, including 5 Americans. Gaddafi praised the gunmen, calling the attacks justified retaliation for Israeli bombings in Tunisia. Then, on April 5, 1986, a bomb exploded in the La Belle Discotheque in West Berlin, killing a U.S. soldier and a Turkish woman and injuring over 200 people. U.S. intelligence claimed to have intercepted Libyan communications confirming responsibility. To Reagan, this was the final proof.
My fellow Americans, at 7 o'clock this evening, Eastern Time, air and naval forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activities. The attacks were concentrated and carefully targeted to minimize casualties among the Libyan people with whom we have no quarrel. Colonel Gaddafi is not only an enemy of the United States. His record of subversion and aggression against the neighboring states in Africa is well documented and well known. Today, we have done what we had to do. If necessary, we shall do it again.
On April 15, 1986, just after 2 a.m., the U.S. launched Operation El Dorado Canyon. American warplanes bombed key targets in Tripoli and Benghazi. One of the primary targets was Gaddafi's heavily fortified residence in Bab el-Azizia. The airstrike lasted just 11 minutes, but it was devastating. Heavy Libyan anti-aircraft fire lit up the sky. Even though one American F-111 aircraft was shot down and crashed into the ocean, the remaining jets returned to Britain, completing one of the longest bombing missions in modern military history. In the end, around 100 Libyans were killed, including Gaddafi's adopted daughter Hana, though her existence remains disputed. 2 hours later, Reagan appeared live on American television, addressing the nation that the strike was a justified act of self-defense, a necessary response to terrorism. Officially, the U.S. claimed the goal was to cripple Libya's terrorist networks, not assassinate Gaddafi. However, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, one of the planners, later remarked, "If we get him, that's a bonus." In the aftermath of the assault, it became obvious that Gaddafi stood isolated. The Soviet Union, despite selling Libya billions in weapons and providing military advisors, stayed silent. It later emerged that the Soviets had taken care to keep their personnel far away from Libya in the days leading up to the attack, clearly avoiding any risk of direct conflict with the United States. Arab and African nations also voiced condemnation of the U.S., but they neither took action nor offered any meaningful support to Libya. Gaddafi felt disappointed. Even his military failed him. The anti-aircraft response was ineffective, the bases were caught off guard, and his advanced Soviet-supplied equipment failed to stop the attack. The bombing rattled Gaddafi to his core. He disappeared into the desert for days. When he returned, he was more paranoid than ever. He intensified internal crackdowns, searching for potential traitors and warning Libyans that the Americans would strike again. He claimed he could export terrorism to the heart of America and called for the destruction of American property worldwide. At the same time, he made quiet attempts to open diplomatic channels, appealing to the Saudis and others to help ease tensions with Washington. The U.S. showed no interest. Before the attack, Reagan had tried to rally European allies against Libya, but his efforts largely fell flat. You see, most of Europe had deep economic ties to Libya and doubted the effectiveness of Gaddafi's influence. Many believed the U.S. had exaggerated the threat, giving Gaddafi more power by reacting so strongly. Only Britain fully supported Reagan, allowing U.S. planes to use British bases. Several NATO allies refused to grant overflight rights, forcing U.S. warplanes to take longer, riskier routes that required multiple mid-air refuelings. The Americans believed the airstrikes would weaken Gaddafi's regime, but instead, it did the opposite. It unified Libyans behind their leader in defiance and handed Gaddafi a powerful narrative that he had survived an attack by the world's most powerful nation. At about 7:03 p.m. on December 21, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103, en route from London to New York, exploded over the small Scottish town of Lockerbie. The aircraft had only been in the air for 38 minutes. A bomb, concealed inside a brown Samsonite suitcase filled with children's clothes, had been smuggled aboard. The briefcase had originated in Malta, passed through Frankfurt, and was ultimately loaded onto the ill-fated Boeing 747 at Heathrow. When the bomb detonated in the cargo hold, it tore a hole through the fuselage. The aircraft broke apart in midair, and its fuel-laden wings fell like fireballs onto Sherwood Crescent, igniting a residential street. 259 passengers and crew perished, along with 11 Lockerbie residents. It was the deadliest terrorist attack ever committed on British soil. In the aftermath, investigators and intelligence agencies were flooded with theories. But the most compelling theory pointed to Iran, seeking revenge for a recent atrocity. In July 1988, 5 months before the Lockerbie bombing, the USS Vincennes, a U.S. Navy cruiser, had shot down Iran Air Flight 655, killing 290 civilians, mostly Iranians. Enraged, Iran allegedly sought retaliation. According to the CIA, the Iranian government paid $10 million to the General Command of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP-GC, to target an American civilian plane. The PFLP-GC had ties to both Syria and Iran, and witnesses later claimed the group appeared flush with money shortly after the bombing. For 2 years, the Iran-Syria PFLP theory dominated. But in 1990, a different narrative began to form. Investigators found a small fragment of a circuit board among the wreckage, allegedly from a Swiss-made timer that had been sold exclusively to Libyan intelligence. From this tiny clue, a new theory took shape. 2 Libyan agents had planted the bomb. British and American investigators identified the suspects as Abdelbasset al-Megrahi, a Libyan intelligence officer, and Lamin Khalifa Fhimah, a former airport security chief. Together, they were accused of placing the bomb in Malta and ensuring it was routed to Pan Am 103. Investigators now had every reason to believe that the Lockerbie attack, according to the new theory, fit into a broader pattern of Libyan state-sponsored violence. On the 14th of November 1991, the US and Britain simultaneously announced formal charges against Megrahi and Fhimah. The indictment accused them of conspiracy, murder, and violating aviation security laws. But Gaddafi refused to extradite them, citing the Montreal Convention, which gave Libya the right to prosecute crimes committed by its nationals on foreign flights. Gaddafi's defiance triggered immediate global backlash. In March 1992, the United Nations passed Resolution 748, imposing sanctions on Libya. A ban on air travel, freezing of assets, and restrictions on oil-related technologies soon followed. In 1993, Resolution 883 strengthened these sanctions, deepening Libya's economic isolation. But the sanctions only went so far. Libya's oil exports were never fully cut off. Countries like Germany and Italy, heavily reliant on Libyan oil, quietly pushed back against a total embargo. Italian refineries even confessed they couldn't process any other type of crude. And so, even under the toughest sanctions, Libya still held economic leverage. Oil contracts continued, and the country remained integrated in the global energy market. Throughout the standoff, Gaddafi insisted he did not know about the Lockerbie bombing. Many observers believe that while Libya may have had a role, the West chose Gaddafi as a politically convenient villain, easier to blame than Iran or Syria, whose cooperation was needed for the Gulf War and the peace efforts in the Middle East. In 1995, Gaddafi lashed out at his Arab allies, calling them untrustworthy after they failed to rally behind him. But just as the Arab League turned its back, an unexpected figure stepped into the spotlight: the South African president, Nelson Mandela. Mandela had long admired Gaddafi for supporting the African National Congress during its struggle against apartheid. In 1997, he visited Libya, awarded Gaddafi the Order of Good Hope, and condemned the sanctions. More importantly, Mandela began mediating. After years of negotiation, Libya agreed in 1998 to a compromise. The suspects would be tried in a neutral third country under Scottish law at a special court set up in Camp Zeist in the Netherlands. In 2000, the long-awaited trial of Megrahi and Fhimah began under intense international scrutiny. The following year, the verdict was in. Fhimah was acquitted and released, while Megrahi was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 27 years. But this troubled many observers. You see, the case against Megrahi rested largely on circumstantial evidence and testimony from controversial witnesses. Critics called the verdict totally incomprehensible. Still, Megrahi was sent to a prison in Glasgow. He continued to protest his innocence, launching multiple appeals. In 2009, he was released on compassionate grounds due to terminal prostate cancer. He returned to Libya and died in 2012. In the meantime, Gaddafi agreed to pay $2.7 billion in compensation and sent a letter to the UN, accepting responsibility for the actions of his officials. However, the statement made no mention of Megrahi's guilt or Gaddafi's direct involvement. As a result, on the 12th of September 2003, the UN lifted all sanctions against Libya. The fallout from Lockerbie isolated Libya on the world stage, turning Gaddafi into a global pariah. But when the scandal finally ended, Gaddafi started to distance himself from terrorism, signaling a dramatic shift in tone. What followed was a calculated effort to repair Libya's image, re-engage with the West, and reclaim a place in the international community. For a while, it worked, but in the end, none of it would save him.